The wagon that carried Clara Whitmore to Iron Creek Ranch in the late summer of 1887 was driven by a half-deaf freighter named Orvis, who spoke maybe 40 words the entire two-day journey and smelled strongly of pipe tobacco, and something else she couldn't identify and didn't want to. She'd hired him in Casper with what was left of the money from selling her mother's sewing cabinet, the last piece of furniture from the house that had been her parents'. Then hers alone after the fever took them both within 6 months of each other. She was 24 years old. She had a skillet, a change of clothes, a journal she wrote in every night, mostly because it was the only conversation she could count on, and a letter from a man named Gerald Watt, who ran the employment office in Casper, saying that Iron Creek Ranch outside of Dunmore, Wyoming, needed a cook. Room and board provided. $12 a month. Orvis let her off at the main gate without a word and turned his mules around before she'd finished pulling her bag from the wagon bed. Clara stood there for a moment with her bag at her feet and looked at the place. Iron Creek Ranch was bigger than she'd expected, a wide spread of buildings arranged around a central yard, a cookhouse set off to the left, bunkhouses running along the east fence, a main house up on a small rise that looked like it hadn't been painted in a long while. The creek itself ran along the northern edge of the property, catching the afternoon light in a way that was genuinely beautiful if you squinted past the mud and the smell of cattle that hit you about 30 seconds after arriving. There were men everywhere, some working, some leaning. She counted at least a dozen just in the yard. They noticed her the same way a crowd notices something unexpected. All at once, then a beat of silence, then the noise. Lord Almighty, what did Gerald send us this time? She couldn't see who said it. She didn't look for him. Gonna need a bigger cookhouse. That one got a laugh. She heard it ripple through the yard. She picked up her bag and walked. Her boots were not good boots. They were her mother's, a size too wide, and they'd given her blisters on the right heel somewhere around the second hour of the wagon ride. She walked anyway. She kept her eyes on the cookhouse door and she walked. Hey there, miss. You sure you got the right place? Cattle ranch, not a bakery. More laughter. Clara pushed open the cookhouse door. The state of the kitchen was genuinely alarming. There was a long wooden work table crusted with the remains of what appeared to be several different meals, a cast iron stove that had grease built up on it thick enough to write your name in, a dry goods shelf that held a sack of cornmeal with a mouse hole chewed through the bottom, some salt, a tin of lard, and 4 mismatched pots hanging from a rack overhead. The floor needed sweeping, the windows needed washing. A dead fly was floating in a bucket of water near the door. Clara set down her bag. She stood in the middle of the room. She breathed through her nose slowly. Then she started taking inventory. She met the foreman an hour later. Rhett Kincaid came through the cookhouse door without knocking, which she suspected was a habit rather than a particular statement about her, though she wasn't completely sure. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, the kind of man who'd learned early that his size worked in his favor and had built a personality around it. He had a jaw that looked carved from something dense and eyes the color of creek water after rain. Not a bad color, but murky, hard to see through to what was underneath. "You're the new cook," he said. "Clara Whitmore." He looked at her the way some men looked at her, which was to say he looked at all of her, starting at her feet and moving up, and his expression during this process did not exactly communicate respect. "Gerald said you had experience." "I cooked for a boarding house in Laramie for 3 years, 40 men, 3 meals a day. This is 60. Then I'll need more supplies than what's currently on that shelf." Something shifted in his face, not quite annoyance, more like he was recalculating. He hadn't expected her to be direct. A lot of men didn't. "Supplies come in on Fridays. You'll make do until then. With cornmeal and lard and whatever's left in the cold cellar, I can make do. But after Friday, I'll need a full inventory of what comes in, written down, dated, signed off." "We don't do it that way." "I do," Clara said. "I've learned it's the only way to keep a kitchen running honest." Rhett Kincaid looked at her for a long moment. "That's a bold thing to say on your first hour here, Miss Whitmore." "It's a practical thing," she said, "not a bold one." He left without saying anything else. She wasn't sure if that was good or bad. Dinner that first night was cornmeal mush with salt pork and whatever onions she'd found in the cold cellar, which was not enough onions but enough to give it some flavor. She made a large pot of coffee, strong, and a pan of skillet bread that came out dense and golden, which was really the best you could do with nothing but flour and lard and a stove you didn't know yet. The men came in shifts. They sat at the long tables and they ate, and most of them didn't look at her. A few made comments she heard and pretended not to. One man, young, maybe 19, with the particular bravado of someone performing for an audience, said something that made the men around him laugh, and Clara felt the familiar heat rise in her chest and forced it back down. She served. She kept the coffee coming. She watched. And then after the second shift had cleared out and she was starting to clean up, she noticed a man sitting alone at the far end of the table near the door. He hadn't been with either of the main groups. He'd come in quiet and sat down quiet and eaten without speaking to anyone around him, though there hadn't been anyone around him. The other men had given him space, not in an unfriendly way exactly, more like he was simply outside whatever circle they operated in. He was older than most of the others, maybe 40, maybe a little past it, the kind of worn-in look that came from years outside in weather that wasn't kind. He had a beard that needed a trim and hands that looked like they'd been broken and healed more than once. His clothes were clean, but old. Not poor, she thought, just practical. He was eating slowly. He was the last one there. Clara brought over the coffee pot. More? He looked up. He had gray eyes, she noticed. Steady and quiet in a way that most eyes weren't. Appreciate it, he said. She poured. He nodded his thanks. I'm Clara Whitmore. Elias Boone. You always eat last? He considered that for a moment, like the question was worth thinking about. Most times. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She went back to cleaning up. When she turned around a few minutes later, he was gone. His plate was scraped clean and stacked neatly at the end of the table. Nobody else had done that. The first 2 weeks were, in the way that hard things sometimes are, clarifying. Clara learned the stove in the first 3 days, learned its hot spots and its cold corners, learned how long the oven actually needed to preheat versus how long the dial suggested, learned that the flue draft was strongest in the mornings and weakest by afternoon, which meant you had to manage the fire differently depending on the time of day. She learned these things through trial and through error, and through a couple of batches of biscuits that came out wrong before they came out right. She learned the men by watching them eat, which tells you more about a person than most other things. There were the ones who ate fast and with their heads down, which meant they were tired or they'd learned somewhere along the way not to enjoy things too much. There were the ones who talked loudly and laughed and took more than their share, which told her something else. There were a few who were genuinely kind. A red-haired man named Perkins, who always said thank you. A quiet Mexican cowhand named Santos, who ate everything put in front of him with an expression of quiet appreciation. And there was Elias Boone, who came in last every night and sat alone and ate slowly and never said anything unless she started a conversation, and even then kept his words economical in a way that felt less like unfriendliness and more like he'd learned to be careful with them. The comments about her size did not stop. She'd expected that they wouldn't. She'd dealt with this her entire adult life and most of her childhood before that. The trick she'd figured out over the years was not that it stopped hurting, because it didn't. The trick was that you learned not to let the pain make decisions for you. Pain was information. Pain said this matters to you. It didn't say do what they want. She kept cooking. She made food that was good because good food was the only argument that ultimately mattered in a cookhouse. By the end of the second week, the biscuit situation had become, without anyone discussing it openly, a daily expectation. Men who'd eaten in silence started showing up a few minutes early. The coffee was always hot. She started keeping notes in her journal, not just personal thoughts, but practical ones. What quantities she used, what ran out first, what days the hunger was sharpest after a long working day. She was building a picture of what this kitchen actually needed versus what it was getting. What it was getting, she realized, was consistently less than what was ordered. Mutt. The first Friday supply delivery came in a wagon driven by a man named Holt, who worked for a supply company out of Dunmore. He and Rhett Kincaid went through the process together at the back of the wagon, while Clara stood nearby with the list she'd written out of what she'd requested. 2 sacks flour, Rhett said. I ordered 4. 2's what came. Clara looked at Holt. The order was 4 sacks. Holt looked at his delivery sheet, then at Kincaid, then back at his delivery sheet. Says 2 here. I wrote 4 on my order. I wouldn't know anything about that, Holt said. She signed for 2 sacks of flour. She went inside and wrote down in her journal, in a column she'd started specifically for this purpose. Ordered 4 flour sacks, received 2. Discrepancy noted. Date, September 6th. It had happened with the salt pork the week before, she now realized. She'd ordered 20 pounds and thought she'd received it, but she hadn't been watching carefully enough then. She started watching carefully. What? You're still here. Elias said it one evening in the 3rd week, not like a challenge, but like an observation. He was sitting at his usual spot at the end of the table, and she'd brought over the coffee and hadn't left yet because it had been a long day, and she was tired, and sometimes you just want to stand somewhere and not move. Did you think I wouldn't be? She asked. He thought about it. Most don't last this long. Most don't need this job as bad as I do. He looked at his coffee cup. That's not why. She studied him. He didn't elaborate. That was the thing about Elias Boone. He'd say something that opened a door and then just stand there and not go through it, and you had to decide if you were going to ask or let it close. Then why? She asked. Because needing something and being willing to do what it takes are different things. He looked up. You're the second kind. Clara sat down across from him. It was the first time she'd sat down at one of the tables. She always ate standing in the kitchen when the men were gone. She wasn't sure why she sat now, maybe because she was tired, maybe because something about the way he said it made her want to stay in the same room as that sentence a little longer. You've been here a while, she said. Long enough. What keeps you here? He didn't answer right away. His eyes went somewhere past her shoulder, somewhere she couldn't see. Something I'm waiting on, he said finally. Waiting for the right time. She wanted to ask what that meant, but there was something about his tone, not closed off exactly, but careful, like a man who'd learned not to say things before they were ready to be said. Well, she said, I understand that. He looked at her again, and for just a moment, something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, more like a recognition, like she'd said something that matched something he already knew. Rhett Kincaid started coming around the cookhouse more after the 3rd week. At first she thought he was just checking on the kitchen, a foreman's legitimate territory. But the visits didn't look like inspection. They looked like something else. He'd lean in the doorway and watch her work. He'd make comments that had a particular texture to them, a kind of presumptive familiarity, and then watch to see how she'd respond. She responded by not responding, by keeping her hands busy and her eyes on the food. One evening he came in while she was prepping the next morning's breakfast, rolling biscuit dough, which required both hands and concentration, and he stood too close and said, You clean up better than I expected, Clara. She didn't look up. Biscuits burn if I stop watching them. I'm not talking about biscuits. I know what you're talking about, she said, and I'm talking about biscuits. He was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed, a short, hard sound, and left. She wrote in her journal that night. Kincaid came by again. Kept it professional. He didn't like that. I don't think he's a man who's used to being handled professionally. It was Santos who first told her to watch herself. He came by the cookhouse on a Sunday morning when the kitchen was empty and she was repairing a seam on her second work dress, and he stood at the door and turned his hat in his hands and said in his careful English, Miss Clara, I want to say something. Say it. Kincaid. He paused, turned the hat again. He is not a man who forgets when he is told no. Clara set down her sewing. I figured that. The cook before you. She lasted 3 months. Santos's eyes were steady and serious. She did not leave because of the work. Did she tell you that? She did not have to. Clara looked at him for a moment. Santos was maybe 35, compact and careful. The kind of man who'd learned to take up only exactly as much space as he needed, and no more. He'd been at Iron Creek longer than most of the others. She could tell that from the way the newer hands looked at him, the quiet authority he carried without claiming it. Thank you, she said. He nodded once and put his hat back on and left. She went back to her sewing. Her hands had steadied themselves without her noticing. The supplies continued to come in short. Not always. Not in a way that was immediately obvious if you weren't tracking it, which she suspected was the point. A sack of flour here. A side of bacon there. 3 weeks in, She had a column of discrepancies in her journal that was getting harder to ignore. She mentioned it once to Perkins, the red-haired cowhand, and watched his face carefully. He frowned. "That does sound off," he said. "Have you talked to Kincaid?" "I've raised it with him, yes." "What did he say?" "That supply numbers aren't always exact, and I should account for variance." Perkins scratched the back of his neck. "That's not really how it works." "No," she said. "It isn't." She didn't push it further with Perkins. It wasn't his fight yet. But she started being very precise with her records, not just the discrepancies, but the whole picture. Every delivery, every quantity, every date. If someone ever needed to reconstruct what had happened in this kitchen, what had come in and what hadn't, she was going to make sure they could. The evening, she found Elias Boone sitting on the fence rail at the edge of the property at sunset, watching the creek. She almost didn't stop. She'd been walking to clear her head after a day that had been particularly wearing in a way she couldn't entirely articulate. But she stopped. She climbed up on the fence rail beside him, not without effort, and she was aware of that, aware of how she looked, and then she was aware of being aware of it, which was the thing she hated most, and sat. The creek was catching the light in that way it did, all gold and copper, and it was genuinely beautiful. "Good evening," she said. "Evening." They watched the water for a while. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Can try. Do you know what's happening with the supplies, the shortages?" He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone who didn't know, the silence of someone choosing what to say. "I know things are not as they should be," he said. "That's a careful way to put it." "Yes." "What are you waiting for, Elias? You said before you were waiting for the right time. What does that mean?" He turned to look at her then. The evening light caught something in his expression that she hadn't seen clearly before, something that went deeper than the day-to-day weathered quiet he carried around with him, something that looked like old grief wrapped in patience. "There's a right way to do things and a wrong way," he said, "and doing the right thing wrong can make it worse." "That sounds like something my mother would have said." "Smart woman." "She was." Clara looked back at the creek. "I keep records of everything that comes in short. I've got dates and quantities and a pattern that doesn't look like accident." He didn't react to that outwardly, but she felt something change in the air between them, some small shift in his attention. "Keep them safe," he said. "I intend to." He nodded, once, like they'd agreed on something. Then he went back to watching the water. Clara stayed there until the light was gone, and neither of them felt the need to fill the quiet. And that was, she thought later, the closest thing to peace she'd felt since she arrived. The summer heat broke in the first week of October, and the days turned sharp and golden in the way that Wyoming autumn did, which was striking to look at and brutal if you weren't dressed for it. Clara had put back enough from her pay to buy a heavier coat at the dry goods in Dunmore, and she made the trip on her Sunday off with Perkins and his wife, who came out from town on weekends. Dunmore was a small town, but it was a real one, with a main street and a lawyer's office and a county recorder's office, where a bored-looking man behind a desk processed land claims and deeds. She noticed it on her way past. She didn't stop, but she noticed it. On the ride back, Perkins's wife, a compact, forthright woman named Della, who had red hair the same shade as her husband, but considerably more opinions, asked Clara how she was getting on at the ranch. "Getting on," Clara said. Della looked at her sideways. "I hear Rhett Kincaid has been making himself a nuisance." "He's been professional," Clara said. Della said it in a way that indicated she did not believe this but would not push. "Just so you know, there are people in this county who keep track of what happens out at Iron Creek. Have for a while." "What does that mean?" Della looked out at the road. "Means things aren't always what they look like out there, that's all. And that people notice." Perkins cleared his throat in the way husbands did when their wives were saying things they found simultaneously true and dangerous to encourage. Clara filed it away. That night, she sat with her journal after the kitchen was clean and the fires were banked and the bunkhouse lights were out. She'd started keeping 2 sets of notes now, the factual record in the front and in the back, observations about people. What they said and what they didn't say. What they noticed and what they avoided. She wrote, "Elias Boone is not what he appears to be. I don't know what he is yet, but I know that much." She wrote, "The county records office is open Mondays through Fridays." She wrote, I am not leaving this ranch. It was not bravado. It was the particular kind of decision that comes when you've run out of the option to run, when you have nowhere to go that's better, and so the only thing left is to stand and figure out what you're dealing with. Clara had reached that point. She was standing. Outside, the wind picked up and rattled the cookhouse windows. Somewhere across the yard, a door banged. She closed her journal, set it under the loose board at the back of her shelf, where she'd put it every night since the second week, and blew out the lamp. In the dark, she listened to the wind. She thought about the creek catching the evening light. She thought about Elias Boone saying, "Keep them safe." She thought about Della Perkins saying, "People notice." Then she closed her eyes and made herself sleep. Because tomorrow she had 60 men to feed, and a stove that didn't heat right until 7 in the morning, and the biscuits weren't going to make themselves. The cold came down hard the second week of October. The kind of cold that didn't announce itself but just arrived one morning and made clear it intended to stay. Clara was up before 4 to get the fires going, which meant she was awake in the dark with nothing but the sound of wind and her own thoughts, which was not always good company, but was at least honest. She'd been at Iron Creek for 6 weeks. The discrepancy column in her journal now ran to 2 full pages. She'd developed a system. Not because she was naturally organized, she wasn't. Her mother had always said she had a chaotic mind that only looked orderly from the outside, but because the situation demanded it. Every Friday delivery, she recorded what she'd ordered, what Holt's delivery sheet said arrived, and what actually made it to her shelves. The numbers rarely matched all 3. Usually the order and the delivery sheet matched, or the delivery sheet and the shelves matched, but seldom all 3 in alignment. The gap wasn't always large. Sometimes it was a quarter sack of flour. Sometimes it was more substantial, but it was consistent, and consistency in a discrepancy is not an accident. It's a method. What she couldn't figure out yet was exactly where the split was happening, between her order and the delivery sheet, meaning someone was altering the paperwork before it left the ranch, between the delivery sheet and the shelves, meaning product was being pulled off the wagon after it was counted, or some combination that moved depending on who was watching. She was still working on that. The biscuits that morning came out well. The oatmeal was thick, and the coffee was strong, and she had a decent salt pork and potato hash going by the time the first shift came in, stamping cold off their boots. The cookhouse was warm. That was the one thing she'd been able to fix simply by keeping the fires right and banking them overnight instead of letting them go out. And she'd noticed that men who came in cold and left warm said thank you more than men who didn't. Small things. But she'd learned to track small things. Perkins came through and said, "Morning, Miss Clara," the way he always did, and poured his own coffee, which he'd started doing around week 3 because she'd told him he was allowed to, and he'd looked genuinely relieved. Santos ate his hash without speaking and nodded once in her direction. A newer hand named Court, who couldn't have been more than 20 and seemed to operate primarily on bravado and anxiety in equal measure, slopped coffee on the table and didn't clean it up. And she brought a rag over and cleaned it herself without comment, because picking that battle first thing in the morning was not worth it. Rhett Kincaid did not come in for breakfast. He'd been doing that lately, skipping the morning meal, showing up later in the day for coffee, circling around the cookhouse in a way that felt less like routine and more like surveillance. She'd mentioned it to no one, but she noted it. The accusation, when it came sideways. It wasn't Kincaid who said it first. That was the smart part of it, she thought later. It was a man named Dooley, one of the older hands. Not a bad man exactly, but the kind of man who reflected whatever he was nearest to. He was sitting at the long table one afternoon with 3 other men when Clara came in from the cold cellar, and he said, not loudly but loud enough, "Funny how supplies keep coming up short since the new cook took over." She stopped. She made herself keep walking to the stove. She set down what she was carrying, a block of salt pork she'd retrieved from the cellar, and she said, without turning around, "What supplies, specifically?" Silence for a moment. "Flour's been coming up short," Dooley said. He was less certain now. She could hear it. He'd been told to say this, she was almost sure. He wasn't the kind of man who formed opinions about flour inventory on his own. "Salt pork, too." She turned around. She looked at him directly, which she'd learned made men like Dooley uncomfortable. "I've been keeping records of every delivery since my first week here," she said. "Every quantity ordered, every quantity received, every quantity used. If the flour is short, it's not from my end. Nobody asked you to keep records, one of the other men said. No, she agreed. I did it on my own account. The men looked at each other. There was a quality to their discomfort that was not quite guilt. They weren't smart enough or involved enough to feel guilt, but something adjacent to it. Unease at being in a conversation that had gotten more specific than they'd expected. She turned back to the stove. Supper in an hour? She said. If you want something to do while you wait, that table could use wiping. They left without wiping the table, but they also didn't bring up the flour again. That evening, she found Elias at the fence again. She'd started to expect him there in the evenings, the way you expect certain things to stay put in a landscape that's always shifting. The creek, the fence post with the broken top rail, Elias Boone at sunset. She climbed up beside him. The cold was sharper now, real cold, and she had her new coat on and was glad of it. Someone told Dooley to say I was stealing, she said. No preamble. They were past preamble. Elias didn't react, not externally. What did you say? I said I had records. Good. Elias? She waited until he looked at her. Who knows about the records besides you? Nobody, if you've been careful. I have been. She pulled the coat tighter. But someone is setting this up. The story is already moving, supplies going short. Cook just arrived, easy to blame. I've seen this kind of thing before. My father had a business partner who did something similar. She paused. Except he didn't have anyone writing things down. You're ahead of where they think you are, Elias said. For now. She looked out at the water. But I need to know, is there anyone at this ranch I can actually trust? Besides you, I mean. Besides Perkins. Someone who has some authority. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. There's a man in Dunmore, he said finally, a lawyer named Aldous. He handles property matters, mostly. He's honest, which out here is not a given. Have you worked with him? Another pause. In a manner of speaking. That's still a very careful way to answer questions. I know. She looked at him. He looked at the creek. After a moment, something in his jaw shifted, not quite resolve, more like someone deciding to move a weight they'd been holding still for a long time. There are things I need to tell you, he said. Not tonight, but soon. Is it about the ranch? Yes. Is it something that will change how this situation looks? He turned and looked at her then, full on, the way he rarely did. And she saw it again, that depth in his expression that she'd been trying to read for weeks. It changes everything, he said. About the ranch, about Kincaid, about why things are the way they are here. She studied him. Then you need to tell me before Kincaid does whatever he's planning next, because I don't think I have much more time before whatever he's building lands on me. I know, he said. I know that. They sat in the cold until the last of the light was gone, and then they went back separately, the way they always did without discussing it. She to the cookhouse, he to wherever Elias Boone went in the evenings, which he had never asked and he had never said. The following week was the worst of it. It started with the payroll ledger. The ranch kept its payroll records in a locked box in Kincaid's office, which was a room off the main barn that smelled of hay and old leather and was always, in her experience, either occupied by Kincaid or locked. On Wednesday morning, 2 of the hands came to the cookhouse looking rattled, and Perkins told her at the noon meal that there was talk of money going missing from the payroll. How much? She asked. $30, near as anyone can tell. Kincaid's saying it happened sometime in the last week. And who does he say took it? Perkins looked at his plate. He had the expression of a man who is carrying something he didn't want to carry. He hasn't said directly, but he's been asking who has access to that side of the barn. Clara was quiet for a moment. The cookhouse was empty. The noon rush had passed and she hadn't started dinner prep yet. Just her and Perkins and the sound of the wind outside. I've never been in that barn, she said. Not once. I know that. Perkins, look at me. He looked up. Do you believe me? He didn't hesitate. Yes. Good. She set down her dish rag. Because things are about to get worse before they get better, and I need to know exactly who's standing where. He was quiet for a moment. Della said something like that last Sunday, that things at this ranch weren't what they looked like. Della's right. She usually is, he said, with the particular exhausted certainty of a man who's made his peace with that fact. What do you need? Right now, nothing. But if I ask you to remember something or witness something, I need to know you'll do it. I'll do it. She nodded once. He finished his coffee and went back out. She stood at the stove for a while after he left, running her hands over the journal in her apron pocket, feeling the shape of it. 40-something pages of dates and numbers and observations. Not dramatic, not a weapon in any obvious sense, just the truth, written down carefully, which was sometimes the only weapon you actually had. Santos found her Thursday morning. He came to the back door of the cookhouse before the fires were even fully going, in the gray pre-dawn, and he knocked twice in the particular way he always knocked. And when she opened the door, his face was different. Not scared. Santos was not a man who scared easily, but alert in a way that had its own kind of weight. Someone was in the cold cellar last night, he said. Clara felt something go cold in her chest. What do you mean? I sleep light, he said. I heard someone moving around on the north side. I looked out. I saw a lantern by the cellar door. He paused. I couldn't see who. She went to the cold cellar immediately. Santos came with her. They stood at the door in the pre-dawn with a lantern and looked at what was inside. The salt pork she'd counted and noted 2 days ago, 46 pounds of it, which was exactly the right amount for the next week's meals, was down to maybe 30. The gap was clean, purposeful. Not someone taking a little here and there, someone who'd moved bulk, quickly, knowing what they were doing. It's the same as with the deliveries, she said. Her voice came out level. She wasn't sure how. Someone's been taking in quantity, the delivery shortages. Maybe some of that was paperwork, but some of it was probably this. Take some off the wagon, take some from the cellar, split it up enough that no single event looks like much. Santos nodded. And when enough is gone, someone needs to explain where it went. She turned and looked at him. And I'm the cook. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Santos, I need you to do something for me. Will you write down what you saw last night? Time? What you heard? What you saw? Sign your name to it? He was quiet for a moment, which was not hesitation exactly, but care. Santos had been on this ranch longer than most, long enough to know what allying yourself with the wrong side of a conflict could cost you. Yes, sis, he said, you could lose your job for this. I have lost jobs before, he said simply. She looked at him. He meant it. She could see that he meant it. Thank you. He took the paper she gave him and wrote slowly and carefully with the handwriting of someone who'd taught themselves, and signed his name and handed it back. She folded it into her journal. She was walking back from the water pump late that afternoon when Kincaid fell into step beside her. She hadn't heard him coming. He was good at that, appearing at the edge of your attention before you decided how to arrange yourself. How are we getting on, Clara? She kept walking. Fine. Settling in all right? 6 weeks is a long time out here. A lot of people cut and run before now. I'm not a lot of people. No, he said. His voice had something in it that wasn't quite amusement. You're not. He matched her pace easily. His legs were longer and she was carrying a full water bucket, and he was not. There's been some talk about the supply situation. I know, I heard duly. People are wondering. People are welcome to come look at my records, she said. I have everything written down. He stopped walking. She felt it before she heard it, a slight absence at her left side. And she stopped too, because you didn't let Rhett Kincaid position himself behind you if you could help it. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, not the contempt she'd gotten used to, not the presumptive interest of those early weeks. Something flatter, more deliberate. Records can be tricky things, he said. People read them different ways. Facts don't read different ways. Numbers do, depending on who's presenting them. He looked at her for a long moment. This could all go easier, you know, if you weren't so set on doing things the hard way. What would the easy way look like? He smiled. It didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Quiet. Keep your head down. Do your work. Let the business of the ranch be handled by people who understand it. And if something's wrong with how the ranch business is being handled, then the people who own this ranch sort it out. He said it with a weight that suggested he considered himself among those people, or at least thought she'd assume he was. That's not your concern, She looked at him steadily. Her heart was moving fast, but her face was not, and she had learned over years that your face was a thing you could control even when the rest of you wasn't cooperating. "Everything that happens in this cookhouse is my concern," she said. "And the cookhouse is supplied by this ranch, so the supply records are very much my concern, and I'll keep them as long as I'm here." His face went very still. That was the thing she'd noticed about Kincaid. When he was actually angry, he got quieter, not louder. The quieter he got, the more careful she needed to be. "You are here," he said, "because nobody else applied." "And I'll be here," she said, "until there's a reason not to be." She walked away from him. She kept her pace even. She did not look back. It was only when she was back inside the cookhouse with the door shut behind her that she set down the water bucket and stood for a moment with her back against the door and breathed. Her hands were not shaking. She was almost surprised by that. "Eats," she told Elias that evening. Not at the fence. It was too cold for the fence by now. But in the cookhouse, after the last shift was done, when she'd started leaving a cup of coffee out on the table like a question, and he'd started showing up to answer it. She told him about the cold cellar, about Santos, about the conversation with Kincaid. He listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without interrupting, without the reflexive reassurances that most people offered when you were telling them something difficult because they were more uncomfortable with silence than you were with your problem. "He's moving faster," Elias said when she finished. "That's what I thought. He knows you're documenting." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Someone told him, or he figured it out. Either way, can he make me disappear from this ranch? He can make it look like you should go." He said it without softening it, which she appreciated. "He can't force you if you don't give him legal ground, but he can make it hard enough that most people would leave." "I've already said I'm not most people." "I know." She looked at him. "Elias, you said you'd tell me soon about what you know about this ranch." He met her eyes. "It's soon," she said. He set down the coffee cup. He looked at the table for a moment, then at his hands, then at her. And she had the sense of watching someone move through a decision they'd been putting off for a long time. Not cowardice, she understood that now. He wasn't a cowardly man. It was something more complicated than that. The particular caution of someone who'd been burned before by doing things at the wrong moment. "The man who built Iron Creek," he said, "was named Thomas Boone." She went still. "He was my father," he said. "He left this ranch to me when he died 7 years ago. Signed and filed at the county recorders in Dunmore." He was looking at the table, not at her, but his voice was steady. "I'd been away, working, mostly. I came back after my wife passed." He stopped, began again. "I came back to take over. Kincaid had been running the operation while I was gone. He'd been here 12 years. He knew every man, every contract, every supplier." "Did he know who you were?" "He didn't know what I looked like. My father hired him after I'd left. He'd dealt with my father, by letter and in person, but never with me." He paused. "When I came back as a ranch hand. I told him my name was Elias Boone, which is my name, and he took me on without making the connection." Clara sat with that for a moment. The cookhouse was quiet except for the fire settling in the stove. "How long?" 3 years? 3 years you've been working your own ranch." "Yes." Eating last, sitting by yourself. Something moved across his face. "Yes." "Why?" She wasn't accusing, she genuinely didn't understand. "If you have documentation, if the deed is yours." "Because I needed to know what was happening here before I could stop it." He looked up at her then. "If I'd walked in and declared myself, Kincaid would have had time to cover it. To move money, to destroy records, to disappear supply evidence. I needed to see it, to understand it completely, to build a case that couldn't be undone by a good lawyer and a foreman who'd been charming local buyers and suppliers for a decade." Clara looked at him, this worn-in, quiet man she'd been eating with and talking to for 6 weeks, who ate last and sat alone and whose hands were broken and healed and whose eyes held something she'd been trying to read since the first night. "And now?" "And now," he said, "you've built half the case for me, and Kincaid is getting desperate, which means he's going to make a mistake. And when he does, You need to be ready. We need to be ready, he said. It was the first time he'd said we. She wasn't sure if he noticed. She noticed. All right, she said. All right? I'm not leaving the ranch. My records are solid. Santos has given me a written account of what he saw. Perkins will stand witness if I need him. I've been doing this for 6 weeks. She folded her hands on the table. Tell me what else you need. He looked at her for a long moment. That recognition again in his expression, the same thing she'd seen on the first night, something matching up. Keep doing what you're doing, he said. Document everything. Don't let him isolate you. And he stopped. And? Be careful, Clara. He's not going to get dramatic. That's not how he operates. He's going to build something quiet, and by the time it's visible, he'll want it to look inevitable. He paused. He's done this before. I believe he's done this before. I just don't have proof of the before part yet. Clara thought about the cook before her. She lasted 3 months. Santos hadn't said she was hurt, just that she hadn't left because of the work. I'll be careful, she said. He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup and looked at it, empty, and set it back down. I'm sorry, he said, for not telling you sooner. I wasn't sure I could trust. He stopped again, reconstituted. I wasn't sure of a lot of things. You're sure now? He looked at her directly. Yes. She gathered the cups. She set them in the wash basin. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving something, sleet, maybe the first of the season, against the cookhouse window in a sound like thrown gravel. Get some sleep, she said. You eat last again tomorrow. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to it. He got up and put on his coat and went out into the cold. Clara stood at the window for a while after the door closed, watching the dark shape of him move across the yard until the dark took him. The sleet tapped against the glass. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. She reached into her apron and took out the journal and opened it to the back section, the one with the observations rather than the numbers, and she wrote Elias Boone, Thomas Boone's son. Deed filed in Dunmore. This is his ranch. 3 years living as a hand on his own land. The word for that is patience, maybe also grief. Both, probably. She wrote, he said we. I think he meant it. She put the journal back. She banked the fires for the night and washed the cups and checked the lock on the cold cellar twice. She was not naive enough to think that having the truth on her side made her safe. Truth was not a shield. Truth was more like a foundation, something you built on, something that held if the rest of the structure was also solid. And the rest of the structure needed work. But it was there. It was holding. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. The sleet that had started the night, Elias told her the truth, didn't let up for 4 days. It wasn't a dramatic storm. Wyoming didn't always do dramatic. Sometimes it just did relentless. And by the second day, the yard had turned to a particular kind of mud that sucked at your boots and made every trip between buildings twice as long and half again as miserable. The cattle were restless. The men were short-tempered in the way that men got when they were cold and confined and couldn't work off whatever was sitting in their chests. Clara cooked through all of it. She kept the fires high and the coffee strong, and she made a beef stew on the third day that was, if she was being honest with herself, one of the better things she'd produced since arriving. The kind of thing where the cold outside made the warmth inside feel like something earned rather than given. Men who came in wet and irritable left quieter. Not grateful, exactly. Most of them weren't built for grateful. But something had shifted in the room over the past weeks that she felt without being able to fully name. A grudging, unspoken adjustment. The way a group of people slowly stop seeing someone as an intrusion and start seeing them as part of the landscape. It wasn't acceptance, but it was the thing that sometimes came before acceptance, if you were patient enough to wait. Kincaid watched it happening. She could tell by the way he watched her now, less like a problem he was going to outlast and more like a calculation he needed to revise. That was the part that worried her. Issy. On the 5th morning after the sleet, the sky cleared and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees to compensate, and Clara found a folded piece of paper that had been slipped under the cookhouse door overnight. She almost missed it. It had gone partly under the edge of the rag rug near the entrance, and she only saw it because she was down on one knee checking the fire damper. She unfolded it, standing by the stove where the light was best. It said, in handwriting she didn't recognize, Springhouse. North of the creek. Friday evening after supper. Come alone. There is something you need to see about where the supplies have been going. No name, no other details. She read it twice. Then she stood there for a while holding it and thinking. The obvious interpretation was that it was a trap. She was aware of that. She was not a woman who romanticized herself into thinking that anonymous, unsigned notes inviting her to isolated locations after dark were generally written by people who meant well. She'd read enough, seen enough, to know what that looked like. But the other possibility that it was genuine, that someone on this ranch who knew something was too frightened to come forward directly, was also real. Santos had come to her quietly. Perkins had been careful about how he said things. There were people here who knew more than they'd said and were measuring the cost of saying it. She brought the note to Elias that evening. He read it standing in the cookhouse doorway, one hand on the frame, his coat still on from outside. His expression while he read it was the particular stillness she'd come to understand meant he was working through something rather than not reacting. "No," he said. "I know what you're going to say." "Then you know not to go." "I know it could be a trap," she said. "I also know it might not be. If someone has seen where those supplies went, physical location, actual goods, that changes the picture considerably. It changes the picture if you're alive to tell it." "Elias." "Clara?" He looked at her directly. His voice didn't rise, but it had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Something that was not quite fear, but sat in the same neighborhood. "Kincaid is not going to drag you into a legal process he can't control. If he decides to end this a different way, he's a thief," she said, "not a killer. Those aren't always different categories." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them was wrong, and they both knew it. "I won't go alone," she said, "but I'm not going to ignore it either. If there are wagons out there loaded with stolen goods, and we can find them with a witness present." She stopped, reorganized. "You said yourself he's going to make a mistake. What if this is it? What if he's trying to move the goods before you can act, and someone who's been helping him got cold feet?" Elias folded the note. He looked at it. He looked at the stove. He had the expression of a man who is fighting two things at once and not enjoying either fight. "Friday is 2 days away," he said. "Yes, I'll go to Dunmore tomorrow. There's something I need to file with Aldous before anything else happens. Something I should have done before now." He said the last part like he was acknowledging a mistake, which from Elias was significant. "When I come back, we decide together. And if we go to that spring house, we go with Perkins and Santos both." "That's reasonable." "It's the only way I'll agree to it." She nodded. He started to go, then stopped in the doorway. He turned back. "Clara, if I'm right about what Kincaid is planning, the supplies, the payroll, the accusations building around you, he's not going to wait much longer. He's going to need to close this out before it gets complicated." "I know. So whatever we do Friday, we need to be ready for the fact that he may already be moving." "I know that too," she said. "Get to Aldous, come back. Then we'll go look at a spring house." He held her gaze for a moment, that thing happening again in his expression, the recognition, or whatever it was, the thing she'd been trying to name for weeks now, without quite finding the word. And then he went out. Oh, he left for Dunmore before dawn Thursday morning. She saw the light moving across the yard from her cookhouse window, a lantern, low, quick, and then the sound of a horse moving out at a walk. He was gone before the sun came up. She cooked breakfast for 60 men without help, which she'd been doing for almost 2 months by now, and had stopped thinking of as a particular achievement. It was just the work. The work was how you kept your footing when everything else was uncertain. At mid-morning, Perkins came in for coffee, and she told him, briefly and without dramatics, what the note said and what she and Elias were considering. Perkins listened the way good men listened, without interrupting, without the immediate urge to tell her what she should do before she'd finished describing what was happening. He wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the table. "Spring house," he said. "Yes. North of the creek." "I know the one. It's old. Hasn't been used as an actual spring house in years. The water source dried up." He paused. "Which means nobody goes out there. Which means if you wanted to store something where it wouldn't be found, it'd be a reasonable place." He looked up. "You want me there." "I want you there. And Santos, if he'll come." "Santos will come." He said it with the confidence of a man who'd worked beside someone long enough to know what they were made of. What about Elias? He'll be back from Dunmore by tomorrow afternoon. Perkins turned the mug in his hands. You know what you're walking into could be bad. Yes. And you want to walk into it anyway. I want to know what's in that spring house, she said, because if there are stolen goods there, goods that match my inventory records, then whatever Kincaid is building against me falls apart, and what Elias needs to do becomes a lot simpler. Perkins was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone was shouting about a fence line that needed mending. The ordinary sounds of the ranch going on, indifferent to anything that happened inside the cookhouse. All right, he said. Friday after supper. I'll tell Santos quiet. Don't tell anyone else. I know how to keep a thing to myself. He stood up, finished his coffee. Della's going to be upset about this when I tell her. Then maybe don't tell her until after. He thought about that. Yeah, probably smarter. He tugged. Elias came back Friday afternoon while she was starting supper prep. He came in through the cookhouse door, and she knew from the way he moved that something had happened in Dunmore. Not bad exactly, but significant. He sat down and she put coffee in front of him and waited. I filed the deed, he said, with Aldous as official witness and notary. It's on record now at the county office. Aldous also had some information. He stopped, chose his words. There have been complaints filed against Iron Creek in the past 2 years. 3 separate suppliers who claim payments were delayed or not made. One of them went as far as formal notice, but dropped it. Dropped it why? Aldous didn't know for certain, but the timing matches up with when Kincaid would have had the most leverage. The previous complaints came when the ranch was between owners on paper, before my father's estate was fully settled. Kincaid was operating with almost no oversight. He looked at his coffee. He's had years to build this. I've been moving too slow. You've been moving carefully, she said. There's a difference. Careful and too slow can look the same at the outcome. She didn't argue with that. It wasn't wrong. The deed is filed now. Aldous has it. What does that mean for tonight? It means that if Kincaid tries to take any legal action against me, or tries to claim authority over a ranch business in any official capacity, he's standing on nothing. He paused. It also means he may find out what I've done, depending on who Aldous talks to and how fast word moves. So we need to move tonight. Yes. Perkins and Santos? I talked to Santos before I came in. He's in. Elias looked at her. Clara, I want you to stay here. I know you do. The note could be a trap. Yes, we've established that. And you and Perkins and Santos are going to walk into that trap without the person who knows what the stolen goods should match because she's been tracking inventory for 2 months? She raised her eyebrows. That makes no sense. He pressed his mouth together. He knew she was right, and she could see him knowing it, which was satisfying in a way that coexisted uncomfortably with the fear that had been sitting in her chest since she found the note. You stay close to me, he said finally. I can agree to that. And if anything feels wrong, we leave. I'm not reckless, Elias. I know. He said it like he meant it. I know you're not. Mummed. They went after supper when the dark was full down and the temperature had dropped to the point where your breath showed and the ground was hard again after the week's mud. 4 of them, moving quiet across the north field toward the creek. Elias first, then Clara, then Perkins, Santos last. Nobody carrying a lantern. The moon was half full and the sky was clear, and out here, away from the ranch buildings, the starlight was actually enough to see by if your eyes had adjusted. The creek sounded different in the cold, lower and slower, and they crossed at the shallow point where stepping stones made it passable without getting wet, though Clara's boot went into the ankle on the second stone, and the cold hit her like a slap, and she kept moving. The spring house was about 200 yards north of the creek, up a low rise through scrub juniper that grabbed at her coat and made quiet movement difficult. They came at it from the west side, downwind of the main door, which Elias had insisted on and which Clara understood was not his first time moving through the dark toward something potentially dangerous. They smelled it before they saw it clearly. Horses. More than one. And beneath that, something else. The flat, dry smell of grain sacks. Cured meat. Elias stopped. He held up his hand and they all stopped. They listened. Nothing moved inside the spring house. No voices, no light under the door. But the horses were tied on the east side. She could hear them shifting now, a soft stamp and blow in the cold. Elias leaned close to her ear. "Stay here with Perkins. Santos and I go to the door." She started to object. He was already moving. She stood with Perkins in the juniper and watched Elias and Santos cross the last 30 feet to the spring house door. Elias tried it. It opened outward, unlocked, which was itself information, because you didn't leave an unlocked door on something you wanted hidden unless you intended to come back to it soon. He looked inside. Santos stood at his shoulder. Elias turned back and motioned her forward. She came out of the juniper and crossed to the door and looked inside. The spring house was maybe 20 feet square, stone walls, low ceiling, and it was loaded. That was the only word for it. Stacked along the walls and across the floor in organized rows, sacks of flour, salt pork wrapped and bundled, grain, cornmeal, 3 crates she couldn't immediately identify. 2 wagon wheels leaned against the far wall for reasons she couldn't work out yet. "Count the flour sacks," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she expected. She started counting. 14 sacks, which was, she ran numbers in her head. She ran them again to make sure, which was approximately the cumulative shortfall from her delivery records over the past 7 weeks, give or take 1 or 2 sacks. "It matches," she said. "You're sure?" Elias said. "I need my journal to be exact, but the approximation matches. This is what's been going missing from deliveries." Perkins had come in behind her. He was looking at the crates. "What's in these?" He pried at the top of one. It wasn't nailed down, just set in place, and lifted it. He looked inside and his face went through something complicated. "That's the payroll box," he said. They all looked. It was a metal lockbox, the kind used for cash, the kind kept in the office off the main barn. "The $30 they said went missing," Clara said. "More than 30 in there from the look of it," Perkins said. She wanted to take the journal from her apron and start writing everything down, cross-referencing, building the documentation in real time. She resisted. There was no light, and she didn't have a lantern, and this wasn't the moment. "We need Aldous out here," she said, "or a sheriff, someone official who can witness and record this." "Aldous can be here tomorrow morning," Elias said. "I can ride to Dunmore tonight." "That's—" The horses on the east side of the spring house moved. Suddenly, loudly, in the way horses moved when something alarmed them. All 4 of them went still. Then the door swung open. Rhett Kincaid walked in with a lantern in his left hand and a man she didn't recognize on his right, broad, thick-necked, the kind of man who was hired for size and didn't ask complicated questions. Behind them, through the open door, she could see 2 more shapes in the dark. Kincaid stopped when he saw them. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like a calculation completing, like he'd considered this possibility and was now implementing a response he'd already prepared. "Well," he said, "I wondered when you'd find it." Clara's chest was moving hard, but her face was not. She'd made it not move. She looked at him steadily. "Whose idea was the note?" "Mine." He set the lantern down on one of the flour sacks. The light spread out across the room and made everyone's shadows long and strange. "I needed to know how close you were. Turns out, pretty close." "You wrote it yourself," she said. "Not someone with a conscience, you. You always did give people too much credit." He looked past her at Elias, and something in his expression shifted. Hardened, she thought, though it was already hard. "Boone, I figured it was you she'd run to eventually." "Kincaid," Elias said. His voice was even. "You've been here 3 years," Kincaid said. "Just working, eating last. I never could figure you out." He tilted his head. "Thomas Boone had a son. I knew that. It just never occurred to me he'd come back acting like a ranch hand." That was the idea. Clever. He didn't say it like a compliment. He said it like he was filing it somewhere, using it. Except clever and legal aren't the same thing. You haven't been here as the owner. You've been here as a hand. Whatever claim you think you've got, the deed was filed yesterday morning with Martin Aldous in Dunmore, Elias said. County recorded, witnessed, and notarized. The stillness that came over Kincaid's face then was different from his usual stillness. It was the stillness of something recalculating under pressure. She watched him do it, watched the options close off one by one behind his eyes. "That changes your plan," she said. He looked at her. "Does it?" Whatever you were going to do tonight, pin the stored supplies on me, add it to the payroll theft accusation, build enough of a case that I'd be removed from the ranch quietly and the evidence would go with me. That doesn't work anymore. The deed is filed. Elias is on record as the owner, which means your authority here is already gone. She kept her voice level. It cost her. You're standing in a spring house full of stolen goods on someone else's property with no legitimate standing. He was quiet for a moment. The man beside him shifted his weight. Outside, the horses moved again. That's a pretty speech, Kincaid said, for a cook. I'm the cook who's been documenting your thefts for 2 months, she said. Written records, witnesses, a man who saw you taking from the cold cellar, delivery discrepancies going back to my first week. She held his gaze. How long do you think you've got? The moment that followed was one of those moments where several things were possible, and the specific thing that happened next would determine a great deal. She knew that. She felt it in the particular way the air sat in the room. Kincaid looked at the man beside him. He looked at the open door. He looked at Elias. Then he looked at her, and in his face she saw the decision being made. Not the reasonable decision, not the one that accounted for the deed and the records and the witnesses, but the cornered animal decision, the one that came from a place below reasoning. He moved toward her. Elias stepped between them. He didn't shout. He didn't make a production of it. He just stepped, and he was between her and Kincaid, and his hand came up against Kincaid's chest and stopped him, not with force exactly, but with a particular kind of stillness that communicated this was as far as it went. Don't, Elias said. Just the word. Quiet. Kincaid looked at his hand on his chest, then up at his face. There was something in the air between them that Clara couldn't entirely read, 3 years of proximity and distance and whatever history lay underneath it. You going to hold me off by yourself, Boone? Perkins, Elias said. Here, Perkins said from the side. He'd picked up something from the wall, a length of fence rail that had been leaning there, and was holding it in both hands with the relaxed competence of a man who'd handled difficult physical situations before. He wasn't dramatic about it. He just held it. Santos, Elias said. Here. And then the thick-necked man beside Kincaid took a step forward, and Clara did something she hadn't entirely planned. She moved to the nearest stack of flour sacks, grabbed the top one by the neck. It weighed maybe 40 pounds, and her arms screamed at the weight, and swung it hard at the thick-necked man's midsection. It connected. The air went out of him. He folded. It was not elegant. The sack split on impact and flour went everywhere. In her hair, on her coat, in the air between them in a white cloud that made everyone cough and blink and that she would have found funny at literally any other moment. Kincaid used the confusion. He shoved Elias sideways. Elias caught himself against the wall and went for the door. Perkins moved to block him, and they collided, and the fence rail went down, and both of them were on the ground for a moment in a tangle that was messy and human and nothing like anything dignified. And then Santos was there, pulling Perkins up, and Kincaid was through the door and gone into the dark. The two shapes she'd seen outside, they were gone too, running. The thick-necked man was still on the floor coughing flour. Clara stood in the middle of the spring house covered in flour dust, her arms aching from the weight of the sack, her heart going very fast, and she looked at Elias. He was upright. He had a cut on his forearm where he'd caught the wall. Not bad, but bleeding. He looked at the door. He looked at her. Are you hurt? He asked. No? She assessed herself. Her ankle was still cold from the creek. Her arms hurt. There was flour in her eyelashes. No, I'm fine. Are you... Your arm. It's nothing. It's bleeding. It's a little blood. Perkins was on his feet, brushing at his coat, looking at the door with an expression that was partly shock and partly something that might eventually become a story he'd tell Della with a certain amount of embellishment. Santos was watching the thick-necked man on the floor, who was not trying to go anywhere. He ran, Clara said. Yes, Elias said. He's going to run for real, tonight. If the deed is filed and the goods are here and he has no standing, he'll try to take what he can and go. Elias looked at her. I need to get to Dunmore, tonight. Aldous. And the sheriff. If Kincaid crosses county lines before morning, go, she said. Clara. I have Perkins and Santos. I have the goods right here. I have records in my apron. She held his gaze. Go get the people who can make this official. That's what we need now. He looked at her for a long moment. 3 years of waiting and watching and eating last and sitting alone, and it had come down to a cold night in a flower-dusted spring house and a decision that needed to be made in the next 60 seconds. Don't let anyone move anything in here, he said. I know. And he stopped. Elias, go. He went. She heard the horse a minute later, moving out from the east side at a canter and then faster, north along the creek. She stood in the doorway of the spring house and listened to it go until the sound was gone. Then she turned back inside. Someone want to help me get him upright? She said, gesturing at the flower-covered man on the floor, who had the particular look of a man who was reassessing every decision that had led him to this specific evening. Perkins and Santos came over. Outside, the cold was absolute and the stars were very clear, and somewhere to the south, the lights of the ranch building showed against the dark, like something that had been waiting patiently all along to be what it was supposed to be. Clara went back inside and stood in the middle of the stolen goods and the spilled flour and waited for morning. The night was very long. Clara had not expected it to be otherwise, but there was a difference between knowing a thing would be hard and living through the actual hours of it. She sat on a flour sack in the spring house with Perkins and Santos and a man named Cully. That was the thick-necked man's name, apparently, and he offered it voluntarily, almost apologetically, once the flour had settled and the reality of his situation had worked its way through to him. And she waited. Perkins had thought to bring rope, which turned out to be useful for keeping Cully in one place without anyone having to sit on him. He didn't fight it. He sat against the stone wall with his wrists tied to a wall hook that had probably once held dried herbs or something equally peaceful, and he looked at the floor and said almost nothing for the first 2 hours. Around midnight, he said, I wasn't going to hurt anybody. Nobody answered him. I just moved things, he said. That's all I did. Moved things from one place to another when Kincaid told me to. You knew what you were moving, Santos said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement. Cully was quiet again. Clara had her journal out. She couldn't do much with it in the dark. Perkins had the lantern, and he was holding it low and careful because they were surrounded by flour sacks, and none of them wanted to find out what happened when an open flame met that much dry grain dust at close range. But she could write by feel, which she'd done before. She wrote down everything she could remember about the spring house's contents from when she'd been able to see clearly. 14 flour sacks. The bundled salt pork. She'd counted 11 bundles. The crates, 2 of which she'd been able to partially see into. The payroll box. She wrote Cully. Large man worked for Kincaid, not the architect. The moved piece. She wrote, Kincaid ran north, or appeared to run north. Hard to track in the dark. She wrote, Elias rode out approximately 9:40 p.m. Dunmore is 11 miles. At speed, he arrives by 11 or shortly after. Aldous will need to be roused. Sheriff will need to be roused. Realistically, they arrive by 2 a.m. at earliest, more likely dawn. She put the pen down. She was not good at waiting. She'd never been good at waiting, which was one of the reasons she'd spent her life doing rather than watching, cooking, working, building things with her hands, filling time with action because stillness gave her too much room to notice what scared her. What scared her right now was that Kincaid had a head start and no reason to stop moving. Perkins talked quietly to fill the dark. Not nervous talk. Perkins wasn't a nervous man. But the kind of talking that people did when they were cold and awake and needed something to hold the hours back. He told her about how he'd come to Wyoming from Ohio 12 years ago, which was almost exactly as long as Kincaid had been at Iron Creek, which was a coincidence he noted with some grimness. He'd come out looking for work and found it and met Della and stayed, the way men did out here, because the land got into you and the life got into you, and one day you realized you couldn't picture yourself anywhere else even when it wasn't particularly good to you. Did you ever suspect Kincaid? She asked. Perkins thought about it. I suspected something. Things didn't add up here and there. Supplies short, payments late. Men who left under clouds that didn't make complete sense. He paused. But Kincaid was good at the job. That's the honest thing to say. The ranch ran. Cattle got moved. Pay mostly came on time, near enough. And when you're getting paid and fed and the work makes sense, You don't ask about the parts that don't quite line up until someone else makes you look at them. Until someone else makes you look at them, he agreed. Santos said nothing, but she saw him nod once in the lantern light, which was more than Santos usually offered on matters of personal culpability. Cully, from his wall, said, "He's been sending things to a buyer in Cheyenne. Has been for 2 years, maybe. Small amounts at first, got bigger." They all looked at him. "I don't know the buyer's name," he said. "Before you ask." "I never knew. I just drove the wagon sometimes, middle of the night, dropped things at a relay point on the South Road." He looked at Clara. "He said you'd be blamed for it. Said you'd made enemies and there was already suspicion and that one more bad supply count would do it." He paused. It sat wrong with me, but I needed the money." "It sat wrong with you," Clara said. "Yes, ma'am." "But you came anyway." He looked at the floor again. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him for a moment. This big, ordinary man who had done a bad thing for an ordinary reason and was now sitting tied to a wall in a cold stone building covered in flour dust, trying to explain himself. She didn't feel sorry for him exactly, but she understood the shape of it. People did things they knew were wrong because the immediate cost of not doing them was clearer than the eventual cost of doing them. That was just how people worked. It wasn't admirable, but it was human. "When Aldous gets here," she said, "you tell him everything you just told me. All of it." "Will it help me?" "I don't know," she said, "but it won't hurt you as much as silence will." He thought about that. Then he nodded, slowly, like a man making a decision he was going to stick to. They came at first light. She heard horses before she saw anything, several of them, moving at a trot on the other side of the creek, and she was at the spring house door when the shapes came over the rise. Elias first, then a man she didn't know on a good horse who had the look of someone official even before she could see him clearly, then 2 more men behind. The sheriff of Dunmore County was a man named Hargrove, compact and unhurried in the way that competent officials often were, with a gray mustache and the kind of eyes that took inventory of a room in about 4 seconds. He came into the spring house behind Aldous, who was a thin man in his 50s who dressed in a hurry and still had his collar not quite right, and he stood in the middle of the room and looked around with the expression of a man who was doing arithmetic. "Those the goods?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said. She pulled out her journal. "I have records going back to my 2nd week here. Delivery discrepancies dated and quantified. A witness statement from Manuel Santos." She indicated Santos, who nodded at Hargrove, attesting to goods being removed from the cold cellar on the night of October 17th. And this man, she gestured at Cully, who transported stolen goods for Rhett Kincaid on at least 3 separate occasions and is prepared to provide a full statement. Hargrove looked at Cully. "That accurate?" "Yes, sir," Cully said. Hargrove looked at Aldous. Aldous looked at the flour sacks, then at Clara's journal, which she was holding out to him. He took it carefully. He was a man who understood documents. She could see that in how he handled it, like it was something real rather than just paper. "The deed," she said. "Filed and county recorded," Aldous said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "I brought the copy. The original is in the county records as of yesterday morning." He looked at Elias, who was standing at the back of the room. "Mr. Boone, as the deed holder, Iron Creek Ranch is legally your property. Any authority Kincaid exercised in your absence was contingent on the understanding that he was managing on behalf of the Boone estate. The estate is now settled, and the property is yours." Elias nodded once. "Where's Kincaid now?" Hargrove asked. "He ran last night," Clara said. "North from what we saw." "We don't know where he went." "He didn't go north for long," Hargrove said. There was something in his voice, not satisfaction exactly, but the close cousin of it. "We passed him about 4 miles out of Dunmore. He was riding with 2 men and a loaded pack horse and riding hard south." He paused. "We brought him in." Perkins said, "You have him?" "In the Dunmore jail as of about 3 hours ago." Hargrove pulled at his mustache. "He had the pack horse, which had—" He looked at Clara. "What I'd estimate is about $40 in cash money, some personal effects, and a ledger book that I expect is going to be interesting reading." A ledger book. Clara looked at Aldous. Aldous looked at her. His mouth moved in something close to a smile, the first time she'd seen any expression close to that from him. "A man who kept his own records," she said. "It appears so," Aldous said. Kincaid had kept records. Detailed ones, probably. The records of a man managing a complex ongoing theft who needed to track what he'd taken and what he'd sent and what he was owed. Because he was not a disorganized man, that was never the problem with him. The problem was that he'd applied his considerable organizational capacity entirely towards stealing. And now those records were in Hargrove's hands. She thought about all the Friday deliveries she'd watched him sign off on, all the supply numbers she'd questioned and he'd waved off. 3 years of this ranch running the way he'd wanted it to run, with no one looking closely enough or staying long enough to put a consistent picture together. "What happens now?" she asked Hargrove. "Now I take statements from everyone here. Formal ones, written down." He looked around the room. "Then I inventory this spring house with a witness present. Then we go back to the ranch, and I talk to Kincaid, and then I talk to whoever else needs talking to." He looked at Clara specifically. "Your records, Miss Whitmore," she said. "Clara Whitmore. Your records will be important evidence. I'll need to take the journal." She looked at it in Aldis's hands. 2 months of mornings before the fires were properly going, 2 months of nights after the dishes were done, dates and numbers and small careful observations. She'd thought of it mostly as protection, her own protection, something to stand on if the accusations landed. She hadn't expected it to become evidence in someone else's case. "You'll get it back," Hargrove said. He had a direct way of speaking that she appreciated. No softening. After the formal proceeding. "All right," she said. She let go of the journal. "Boss." They walked back to the ranch in the early morning light, the whole strange company of them. Hargrove and his 2 deputies, Aldous picking his way carefully through the scrub with his good shoes, Perkins and Santos and Cully, who walked with his hands still tied and his head down, and Elias and Clara. The ranch looked different in the cold, clear morning. She wasn't sure exactly how. It was the same buildings, the same yard, the same fence lines, running out toward the same winter flat pasture. But something about knowing what she now knew made the whole place sit differently in her vision, like when you find out the name of something you've been looking at without understanding, and suddenly it resolves. This is Elias Boone's ranch. It has been, for 7 years, on paper. For 3 years, in body, while he ate last and stayed quiet and watched and waited. And now the paper and the body and the truth of it are all in the same place at the same time. The men were starting to come out for breakfast when they walked into the yard, early risers coming toward the cookhouse, stopping when they saw the sheriff's horses tied at the rail, stopping again when they saw Cully with his hands bound, stopping again and again as the morning assembled itself into something none of them had prepared for. Word moved fast in the way that word always moved in close quarters. By the time Clara had the fires going and the coffee on, the cookhouse was fuller than she'd ever seen it before actual mealtime. Men standing at the walls because there wasn't enough bench space, talking in low voices, looking at Hargrove and his deputies, and at Aldous, who'd set up at the end of the long table with his papers spread out. Elias stood near the door. He hadn't said much since they'd come back from the spring house. He had that quality he got sometimes, not withdrawn, but very interior, like he was processing something privately that was too large for immediate public handling. She brought him coffee. He took it without looking at it. "When do you tell them?" she said quietly. He looked at her. "Tell them what?" "Who you are." He looked out at the room full of men he'd been working beside for 3 years. Men who'd seen him as a hand, unremarkable, the guy who ate last. She could not imagine exactly what that was like, to stand in a room full of people who didn't know you and to know that what you were about to say was going to change every single thing they thought they understood about the last few years. "Hargrove wants to do this formally," he said. "Gather everyone. Full disclosure, official record." "That's probably right." "Yes." He drank the coffee. His jaw was tight. "It doesn't feel the way I expected it to feel." "What did you expect?" He thought about it. "Simpler, maybe. I've been waiting for this long enough that I'd started to think of it as just an end, a finish line." He looked at the room. "It's not a finish line. It's the beginning of something I'm not entirely sure I know how to do." She looked at him. "You've been running this ranch from the bottom for 3 years," she said. "You know how to do it." I've been running it in pieces. From the outside. It's different when—" He stopped. "When it's yours to keep," she said. He looked at her. Yes. She didn't tell him it would be fine. She had a policy against telling people things she couldn't guarantee. "You'll figure it out," she said instead, which was different. An assessment rather than a promise. She believed it. She said it because she believed it. He nodded once. He held the coffee mug with both hands. Hargrove gathered everyone at 10 in the morning. He did it efficiently. Sent his deputies to the bunkhouses and the far pasture to bring in whoever was working, and by 10 o'clock there were nearly 50 men standing in and around the cookhouse, which couldn't hold them all, so the door stayed open, and the ones who couldn't get inside stood in the cold yard and craned to hear. Hargrove stood at the front of the room with his thumbs in his belt and explained in plain language and without particular drama what had been found in the spring house, what Cully had confirmed, what the ledger from Kincaid's pack horse indicated, what the delivery records. He gestured at the table where Aldous sat with Clara's journal, documented going back to September. The room listened. She watched their faces from her position near the stove. Dooley, who'd been the one to say out loud what Kincaid had told him to say about the flour shortages, going progressively more red as Hargrove talked. Court, the young one, looking confused and then alarmed. Santos, with his arms crossed and his face neutral in the way it always was when he was paying closest attention. Perkins standing near the back with his arms crossed, and a look that said, "I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know exactly what." Then Hargrove said, "The deed to Iron Creek Ranch was filed in county records yesterday morning by Martin Aldous, acting as notary. The deed, which was executed upon the death of Thomas Boone 7 years ago, names as owner his son, Elias Boone." He paused. "Who has been present on this ranch for the past 3 years, working as a ranch hand under his legal name, while gathering evidence of the ongoing theft conducted by the former foreman, Rhett Kincaid?" 50 men turned and looked at Elias Boone. The silence lasted for about 4 seconds, which doesn't sound long, but it was. Dooley said, "You're Boone? You're Thomas Boone's—" "Yes," Elias said. 3 years, someone else said. 3 years you've been here, and you never— I needed to understand what was happening here before I could stop it." He said it simply, not defensively. He wasn't apologizing and he wasn't performing. He was just stating the fact. "I couldn't do that as the owner. I could do it as a hand." Another silence. A different quality to this one, the room digesting something too big to take in quickly. Court said, loudly and without thinking, "You ate last every night." And something happened then that she hadn't anticipated. Several of the men laughed. Not mean laughter. The other kind, the kind that comes out of absurdity and relief and the release of tension all at once. And even Elias's face did that thing that wasn't quite a smile, but was close to it. "I did," he said. Okay. The formal part took the rest of the morning. Hargrove took individual statements, starting with Clara, who sat across from him at the table and walked him through the records methodically, and he listened and asked good questions and wrote everything down in his own notebook in addition to taking her journal. Aldous reviewed the deed documentation alongside. Cully gave his statement at the far end of the table with one of the deputies present, and from the occasional fragment she caught, it was detailed. Names, dates, the relay point on the South Road. The arrangement with the Cheyenne buyer whose name Cully eventually remembered was something like Harbert or Harker. He couldn't be certain. Santos gave his statement about the cold cellar. Perkins gave his statement about his general knowledge and what he'd witnessed in the spring house. 2 of the other hands came forward independently, which surprised her, men she'd barely spoken to, including one of the men who'd been sitting with Dooley when the flour accusation was made, who said that Kincaid had told them to say what they'd said, and he'd been uncomfortable about it and wanted that on the record. She hadn't expected that. People's consciences worked on their own timelines, and sometimes the timeline was short. She was at the stove making midday food because 50 men still needed to eat regardless of what was happening at the table, and nobody else was going to do it, when Dooley came over to her. He stood near the stove in a way that suggested he'd been working up to this for a while. He was a big man, and he looked uncomfortable the way big men did when they were trying to be small about something. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She kept stirring the pot. "Dooley, I want to—" He stopped. Started again. "What I said about the flour, the supplies. Kincaid told me to say it, And I did. And I want you to know I didn't. He stopped again. I didn't think it through. She looked at him. His face was doing something difficult. No, she said. You didn't. I'm sorry. She studied him for a moment. He was not a bad man. She'd thought that from the beginning. He was the kind of man who moved in the direction of whoever had authority over him, which was a character flaw and also one of the most common human tendencies in existence. I know Kincaid put you up to it, she said. I also know you were standing at that table and had the option to say nothing. She paused. But it's done. And what you do now is what I'll remember. He nodded, heavily. He didn't try to say anything else. She appreciated that. She went back to stirring. Hargrove left at 2 in the afternoon with Cully and his deputies and enough documentation to build what he called a considerable case against Kincaid. And he said the phrase with the satisfaction of a man who had spent time dealing with cases that were not considerable and appreciated the difference. He shook Clara's hand before he left. He shook it like she was a person of substance and not a cook. Your records, he said, are going to be the spine of this. They're just numbers, she said. Numbers written down accurately are the rarest thing in a fraud case, he said, in my experience. After they left, the ranch settled into something that was not quite normal. Too much had happened too fast for normal, but was at least calm. Men went back to work. The cattle didn't care about any of it, and the fences still needed mending, and the winter was coming regardless. Clara cleaned the cookhouse. She did it the way she did everything, methodically, completely, working from back to front. She scrubbed the stove and washed the table and swept the floor and put the supplies back in order. Her arms still ached from swinging the flour sack. There was still flour dust in her hair that she'd missed when she'd washed up that morning. She swept and scrubbed and put things in order because that was what she knew how to do when the world was bigger than she could hold all at once. Elias came in around 3. He stood in the doorway the way he had since his second week, like a man who'd learned not to assume he was welcome anywhere but had made his peace with asking. Come in, she said. You don't have to stand in the door anymore. He came in. He sat at the table. She made coffee. She'd made probably 12 pots of coffee in the last 16 hours, and she thought she might never stop, and sat down across from him. He looked tired. Not the ordinary end-of-day tired, but the deeper kind that came from carrying something for a long time, and then setting it down and discovering that the absence of the weight was its own kind of strange. How are you doing? She asked. He considered this. I don't know yet. That's honest. It doesn't feel like I expected. He looked at his coffee. I expected to feel, I don't know, settled, like something was done. He looked up. It's not done. No. Kincaid's in jail, but there's a trial. The Cheyenne buyer, the suppliers who were shorted, the payroll. She ticked them off without drama. It'll be months before it's settled. I know. He paused. I also need to run a ranch. Yes. A ranch where half the men found out today that I've been lying to them for 3 years. You didn't lie about anything that mattered, she said. He raised an eyebrow. Your name is Elias Boone. You worked hard. You were honest about every part of the work. She met his eyes. You just didn't volunteer the part about the deed. Those are different things. Some of them won't see it that way. Some of them won't, she agreed. But Perkins will, Santos will, and those are the ones whose opinion's worth having. She paused. The rest will come around or they won't. You can't run a ranch by committee anyway. He looked at her for a moment with that expression, recognition was still the closest word she had for it, and said, What are you going to do? The question landed differently than she expected. She'd been so focused on the immediate thing, the records, the springhouse, Kincaid, the morning, that she hadn't let herself think past it. There hadn't been time. I'm going to start thinking about next week's supplies, she said, since the order will need to go in tomorrow if we're going to have what we need by Friday. Clara. And I should probably look at what's actually in the cold cellar now that it's not being raided, because I've been compensating for shortages for 2 months, and I'd like to know what I'm actually starting with. Clara. He said it with a particular patience that meant, I know what you're doing, and I'm not going to let you do it. She stopped. I'm asking what you want, he said, not what you're going to do next. What you want. She looked at him. The cookhouse was quiet. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. Through the window, the yard was empty in the afternoon light, cold and clear, the winter sky coming down enormous and blue over the whole spread of Iron Creek. "I want to stay," she said. He nodded. "If you'll have me." "As cook," he said. It wasn't a question exactly. "As cook," she said. "To start with." Something shifted in his expression, something careful and slow, the way he moved through everything. Nothing rushed, nothing performed. "The ranch is going to need work," he said. "A lot of it. Rebuilding what Kincaid damaged, restoring what was taken, getting the books into a state that actually reflects what's here." He paused. "It's going to be a hard year." "I've had harder," she said. "I know you have." He held her gaze. It would help to have someone who—" He stopped, reorganized. Elias was not a man who talked about what he wanted directly. She'd learned that. He came at it sideways, which was fine. She was patient. "I'd want you involved," he said finally. "In more than the kitchen. If you're willing." She thought about the word involved. It was a careful word, a beginning word, not an ending one. She understood why he chose it. "I'm willing," she said. He nodded. He drank his coffee. Outside, one of the hands was crossing the yard toward the bunkhouse, moving fast in the cold, and she could hear the creak of the barn door and the particular sound of Iron Creek itself, water moving steadily north in the early dark. The ranch was still there. It had been through a foreman who'd spent years treating it as something to extract from rather than tend, and it was still there. The cattle, the fences, the creek, the cookhouse fire that Clara had kept burning every morning for 2 months. These things were stubborn in the way that good things sometimes were. "Duly apologized," she said. "I heard." "What are you going to do with him?" Elias thought about it. "He's a decent hand, not much backbone, but decent hands are easier to find than the other kind." He paused. "I think I'll keep him." "That's generous?" "It's practical." He looked at her. "You're the generous one. You accepted his apology." "I didn't forgive him," she said. "I just told him what the options were. The forgiving is its own separate thing, and it takes longer." He nodded, like that was the right answer. Like he'd been waiting to hear someone say that forgiving and accepting were not the same transaction and you didn't have to do them simultaneously. She got up to check the stove. The afternoon light was going and dinner needed to happen, because it always did, because 60 men's hunger was the most constant thing at Iron Creek Ranch, and probably always would be. "Elias," she said. You're going to need to hire a new foreman." "I know. Someone who actually works for you this time." "I'm aware." She thought about saying something else. Several things moved through her mind. About what the ranch could be with someone running it honestly. About what a hard year might look like if you were building something rather than defending something. About the particular quality of the look on his face when he'd stepped between her and Kincaid in the spring house. She said none of those things. There was time. "Dinner in an hour," she said instead. "I'll eat last," he said. "No," she said. "You won't." He looked up. "You own the ranch," she said. "You eat when you're hungry." Something crossed his face, something that was finally, fully, a smile. Small and a little rough around the edges, the kind of smile a man had when he'd forgotten what it felt like to have something to smile about, and was relearning it from scratch. "All right," he said. She turned back to the stove and started dinner, and the fire burned steady, and outside the darkness came down clear and cold over Iron Creek. The week after Hargrove rode out with Cully, and the documentation was the strangest week Clara had spent at Iron Creek, which was saying something given the 2 months that had preceded it. It wasn't dramatic. That was the strange part. She'd expected the aftermath of everything to feel larger somehow, more conclusive, more like an ending. Instead, it felt like the morning after a storm, when the damage is real and visible, but the sky is just sky again, and the work of clearing things up is ordinary work, not heroic work, just the thing that needs doing. She cooked. She rebuilt the supply inventory properly for the first time, going through the cold cellar and the dry goods shelf and the smokehouse with a fresh sheet of paper and writing down exactly what was there. It was more than she'd thought. The Springhouse goods had been returned and cataloged as evidence, but Hargrove had confirmed she could use them pending the formal proceeding, since starving 60 men was not in anyone's legal interest. She had 4 sacks of flour accounted for properly for the first time since September. It felt almost ridiculous how good that was. Elias was busy in a different way. She'd watch him from the cookhouse window sometimes, crossing the yard with Aldous, who came out from Dunmore twice that first week, or standing at the barn door talking with Perkins for long stretches, or alone at the desk in the main house, which he'd moved into without ceremony the morning after Hargrove left, just picked up the few things he kept at the bunkhouse and carried them up the rise to the house that had been his father's and was now his. The main house had been Kincaid's domain for years, and it showed. Not filthy. Kincaid was not a filthy man, but stripped of anything personal, anything that indicated someone lived there rather than operated from there. The furniture was practical and impersonal. The walls were bare. The kitchen in the main house had clearly not been used for actual cooking in years, just coffee and the occasional meal brought over from the cookhouse. She didn't comment on it. It wasn't her place to comment on it. But she noticed. The thing nobody told you about justice, Clara thought during those early weeks, was how administrative it was. She'd imagined, not consciously but somewhere underneath the practical thinking, that once Kincaid was caught and the evidence was documented and the deed was filed, there would be some moment of clear resolution. A line. Before and after. Instead, there were forms and statements and a trip to the county seat that Elias and Aldous made together in the 3rd week, and letters back and forth with the sheriff's office, and a process that moved at the pace of official processes, which was to say slowly and with frequent stops for additional documentation. The formal proceeding against Kincaid was set for January, which was 6 weeks away. The Cheyenne buyer, his name turned out to be Harwick, not Harbert or Harker, Cully had been close, was being investigated separately by authorities who were not Hargrove and had jurisdiction Clara didn't entirely understand. 2 of the suppliers who'd been shorted filed formal claims in November. The whole thing was going to take most of a year to fully resolve, Aldous told Elias, which was not surprising but was the kind of thing that sat heavy. Through all of it, Clara wrote in her journal. Not the records column anymore, that had gone with Hargrove, and she'd started a clean one for the new supply system, which was running honestly for the first time and was therefore considerably less eventful to document. She wrote in the back section now, the observations 1, and she wrote about things she hadn't expected to think about. She wrote, "There's a difference between surviving something and getting past it. I've been surviving things for years. My parents dying, the boarding house in Laramie closing, arriving here with $37 and a skillet and being laughed at before I'd set my bag down. I survived all of that. But surviving is a kind of holding pattern. It's not the same as going somewhere." She wrote, "I don't know exactly when the shift happened. Maybe it was writing the first discrepancy in the records column. Maybe it was sitting on the fence with Elias that first evening watching the creek. Maybe it was swinging a 40-pound flour sack at a large man in the dark and not thinking about it first, just doing it. But something changed from enduring to something else. Something that felt like mine." She didn't share these entries with anyone. They were the kind of thoughts that lost something when spoken out loud before they were ready. Checked. Kincaid came back on a Tuesday night in late November. She found out about it the way she found out about most things that happened after dark at Iron Creek. From the sounds. A horse moving fast in the yard, voices she didn't recognize, then the specific sound of something going wrong, which was different from ordinary ranch noise in a way she'd learned to identify. A quality of urgency underneath the volume. She was out the cookhouse door in her coat before she'd fully thought about it. The yard was dark except for the lantern light from the main barn, and it took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. There were 2 horses she didn't recognize tied at the barn rail. The barn door was open. Inside she could hear voices, one of them Kincaid's, which she recognized immediately. That flat, deliberate quality that had always been in it, just stripped now of the surface authority that had cushioned it before. She understood it in parts. Kincaid had gotten out of the Dunmore jail. She learned later he'd paid someone, or someone had paid someone. The details took weeks to reconstruct, and come back to Iron Creek not to reclaim anything, because he was not a stupid man and he understood that ship had sailed, but to take the payroll before it could be properly locked away under Elias's management. The payroll that was due Friday. The cash that had come in from Dunmore 2 days ago and was sitting in the lockbox in the barn office. She found out later that Kincaid had spent a week working out exactly this plan, that he'd known about the payroll timing, that he'd ridden hard through 2 days of cold to get here and intended to ride harder out. He'd brought one man with him, somebody from Cheyenne, nobody any of them knew. What she knew in the moment was that she could hear Kincaid's voice and one other voice inside the barn, and that she could also hear Elias's voice, which meant Elias was in there, and that the quality of the exchange was the quality of something that had not yet resolved but was moving fast toward resolution one way or another. She did not go back to the cookhouse. She went to the barn. She went in through the side door, the smaller one on the west wall that the men used for quick access to the tack room, which she'd learned about in her first week, because it was closer to the cookhouse, and she sometimes sent hands through it to get equipment without them tracking all the way around. She pushed it open as quietly as she could and slipped inside. The barn smelled of hay and cold and horses, and it was dim except for a lantern sitting on the floor near the office door. Kincaid was standing with his back to her, between the lantern and the office, and she could see now that he had a gun, a revolver, held low, not pointed at anyone currently, but present in a way that was communicating something clearly. The man from Cheyenne was near the barn door, watching the yard. Elias was in the office doorway with his hands slightly raised, not all the way, just enough to show they were empty. He had the lockbox behind him. He'd been in the office, she didn't know why, paperwork maybe, he'd been in there a lot lately, when Kincaid arrived. "I'm not going to shoot you," Kincaid was saying. He said it the way he said everything, even deliberate, like he was explaining something that should be obvious. "I just want the box. You give me the box, I walk out of here, and this is over." "It's not over," Elias said. "There's a warrant. You left the jail, Rhett. You understand what that means." "I understand what it means fine. I also understand I'm not going to sit in a county jail through a January trial on your testimony and a cook's account book." His voice changed slightly. "Give me the box." Clara stood very still just inside the side door. Her eyes had adjusted enough to see the whole layout now. The man at the barn door was watching the yard but hadn't looked toward the side wall. Kincaid was focused entirely on Elias. The lockbox was behind Elias in the office. $40-some of payroll cash and the month's financial records. Not enough money to disappear on, but maybe enough to get to somewhere that didn't have a warrant, or enough to feel like something when you'd lost everything else. She looked at the barn around her. The side wall was lined with tack, saddles, bridles, coiled rope. On the hook nearest her was a coil of heavy hemp rope, the working kind, thick and stiff. She was not a woman who thought in dramatic terms about herself. She was not someone who narrated her own decisions as though they were taking place in a story. She just looked at the rope and looked at the man by the barn door whose back was 3/4 to her, and she thought, all right. She lifted the rope off the hook. It was heavy, and her arms still had the memory of the flour sack in them, that same reaching past capacity feeling, and she ignored it the way she'd learned to ignore things that needed ignoring. She moved along the wall toward the man from Cheyenne. She moved the way she moved in the kitchen at 4 a.m. when she was trying not to wake anyone, not tiptoeing, which was actually louder, but deliberately, placing each step. She was 6 feet from him when Elias saw her over Kincaid's shoulder. She saw his eyes track to her and then very deliberately track back to Kincaid, and he did something she would think about for a long time afterward. He didn't change his expression, didn't give her away, just held Kincaid's gaze and said, "You know the suppliers are talking, Rhett. Harwick's already given a statement. There's nowhere to go that this doesn't follow you." "There's always somewhere," Kincaid said. Clara swung the rope. It was not elegant, and it was not precise. She caught the man from Cheyenne across the shoulders and the back of the head, the heavy coil connecting with a sound that was not anything like what she expected, more of a dense thud than any dramatic crack. And he went forward and down and hit the barn door with his shoulder on the way, which was loud enough to startle the horses in the nearest stall and loud enough to make Kincaid spin around, which meant his back was to Elias. Elias came through the office doorway and covered the distance in 3 strides and hit Kincaid's wrist with the edge of his palm, a hard, flat strike. And the revolver dropped and skittered across the barn floor and ended up somewhere under the hay near the wall. Kincaid swung at him. Elias took the hit on the shoulder. She heard it, a solid sound, and shoved Kincaid back against the wall and held him there, one forearm across his chest, the whole weight of 3 years and every indignity of them in that single physical fact. The man from Cheyenne was not unconscious. He was on his hands and knees being angry about it, and Clara was standing above him with what was left of her rope coil, and she said, "Don't," in the same tone she used in the cookhouse when someone was about to do something inadvisable near a hot stove. And he looked up at her, and something in her face or her posture, or maybe just the fact that she'd already knocked him down once, made him stay where he was. Perkins came through the main barn door 30 seconds later with Santos behind him. She never knew exactly what had woken them: the noise from the barn door, the horses, some instinct that came from living close to the ground and knowing when something in the environment had changed. But they were there, and the situation was done. Kincaid was breathing hard. His face, in the lantern light, looked like something that had been maintained with great effort for a long time and had finally stopped being maintained. The lines of it were deep. His eyes, which had always been murky and difficult to read, were just tired now. "It's over, Rhett," Elias said. He said it without heat, without the satisfaction she might have expected and maybe would have understood. He just said it like a statement of geography. "Here is where we are. This is what it is." Kincaid looked at him. Whatever he saw there seemed to answer something because he stopped. He didn't sag exactly. He just stopped. "You should have just told me," he said. "When you came back, you should have just said who you were." "I know," Elias said. "We could have, I don't know, figured something out." "Could we have?" Kincaid was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "Probably not." "No," Elias agreed. "What?" Hargrove came out the next morning and took Kincaid back to Dunmore, this time with considerably more documentation around his containment. The man from Cheyenne went with him. The paperwork this generated was, from Aldis's description when he came out 2 days later, substantial. The January trial happened. Clara gave testimony for about 40 minutes, which was less than she'd expected and more precise, Aldis said, than most testimony he'd heard from people who weren't lawyers. The records she'd kept were admitted into evidence. Santos testified. Perkins testified. Cully, who had cooperated fully with Hargrove's investigation, testified in exchange for a reduced charge that Aldis said was fair, given what he'd actually done versus what Kincaid had orchestrated. Kincaid was convicted of theft, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty on behalf of the ranch estate. The sentence was 4 years in the territorial prison at Laramie. The Cheyenne buyer, Harwick, was convicted separately of receiving stolen goods and received 2 years. The supplier's claims against Iron Creek were settled in February, partly in cash and partly in future contracts, which Elias negotiated directly and which Aldis described as reasonable on both sides. By March, the formal legal part of it was finished. What came after was just living, which was, Clara thought, harder in some ways than all the rest of it. The ranch was in better shape than she'd expected, considering. Kincaid had been a thief, but he'd also been competent, and the underlying operation, the cattle, the land, the basic infrastructure, was solid. What he'd damaged was financial and institutional, the trust with suppliers, the accounting records that needed rebuilding from scratch, the morale of men who'd been lied to by the person they were supposed to answer to. That last part was what took the longest. Elias was not, it turned out, a natural manager in the way some men were. He was good at seeing what needed doing and doing it himself. He was less comfortable telling other men what to do, less comfortable with the particular kind of authority that required you to occupy a room differently than the other people in it. He'd spent 3 years learning to take up no space at all, and the undoing of that was slow. She watched him work at it. Some days it went better than others. There was a morning in February when he'd had to let a hand go, a man named Briggs who had been caught falsifying his own work hours. Small thing comparatively, but not something you could let slide on a ranch that was rebuilding its integrity. And afterward, Elias stood in the cookhouse with his coffee and didn't say anything for a long time. "How'd it go?" she asked. "Fine." "Did he argue?" "Some." He drank the coffee. "I hate that part." "Firing someone?" "Having to be the person who—" He stopped. "The authority part. It doesn't sit naturally." "It's not supposed to sit naturally," she said. "People who find that easy are usually the ones you shouldn't trust with it." He looked at her. "You find it easy." "In a kitchen," she said. "That's different. I know what I'm doing in a kitchen, so the authority follows from the competence. You're still learning what you're doing as an owner. The authority will follow when you trust your own judgment more. He thought about that. You don't always make things easier, you know. You want easier, talk to Perkins. He'll tell you you're doing great. Perkins does say I'm doing great. See? He almost smiled. He finished the coffee and went back out. She watched him cross the yard, this worn-in, careful man who'd spent 3 years eating last at his own table, and she thought about what it cost to wait for something that was yours. Not just the time, the particular kind of erosion that happened when you held yourself smaller than you were for long enough. The way it got into your posture and your habits, and the way you moved through a room. He was working against 3 years of that. It was slow, but she'd watched him do it. Spring came in late March, the way Wyoming spring did, tentatively, suspiciously, with several setbacks before it committed. The mud returned, and then the green came up through it, and the creek ran high and fast with snowmelt, and there was a morning in early April when Clara stood at the cookhouse window with her first coffee of the day and watched the light come up gold over the east pasture and thought, I live here. Not I work here. Not I am surviving here. Live. The journal had new things in it by then. Not the supply records, which had become so routine they were almost boring, which was exactly what she'd wanted. Other things. Observations about the ranch and the different light of a place you'd started to know the way you knew your own kitchen, the spots where the ground froze last in winter, the way the cattle moved differently on cold mornings, the particular character of each hand as she'd come to understand it over months rather than weeks. She'd started doing the books. That was how it happened. Elias had come to her in December saying that Aldous had recommended someone help with the ranch accounts given how tangled they were, and he'd asked if she'd be willing to learn, and she'd said yes because she'd seen enough of the financial picture to know she already understood more of it than she'd realized. Aldous had come out for a week and walked her through the method, and she'd taken to it the way she'd taken to the records column in the journal, with the satisfaction of someone who likes knowing exactly where things are. By spring, she was doing the books every week, which meant she sat at the desk in the main house office for several hours on Saturdays, which meant she was in the main house regularly, which had a kind of gravitational logic to it that she chose not to examine too directly. The main house had changed since Elias moved in. Not dramatically. He wasn't a man who changed things dramatically, but in small accretions. A photograph on the mantel that she hadn't seen before, which turned out to be his parents, his father looking like an older and more comfortable version of Elias, his mother looking like someone who had survived things and not been diminished by the surviving. A worn blanket on the chair by the fire that had clearly traveled a long way with him. A coffee cup that sat on the desk permanently, always present, the kind of object that only develops that quality over years. She asked about his wife once. She hadn't asked before, not because she wasn't curious, but because she understood there were things that people held carefully and you didn't put your hands on them without being invited. He told her. It was an evening in April, late. She was finishing the week's accounts and he was doing something at the other desk that she'd stopped tracking, and he said, unprompted, her name was Ruth. She looked up. She died in the winter of '84, he said. Fever. She was 29. He said it looking at the photograph on the mantel. She would have liked this place. She always wanted land. He paused. That was part of why I came back. Not just the ranch, but because it felt like... He stopped. Tried again. She would have wanted me to. Clara was quiet for a moment. Do you feel like you've done right by her? He thought about it. She liked that he thought about things before he answered them. I'm starting to, he said. She nodded. She went back to the accounts. He went back to whatever he was doing. The fire burned, and the night outside was quiet, and the house held them both in a way that felt earned rather than accidental. The thing about worth, and this was something Clara turned over in her mind many times during those months, not as a lesson she was trying to arrive at, but as a thing she kept circling back to because it kept being true. The thing about worth was that she'd spent most of her life letting other people assign it to her. She'd understood this intellectually for years. She'd known, in the way you can know things while still being shaped by them, that her value as a person was not actually determined by how her body looked, or how much money she had, or whether the men in a cookhouse laughed when she walked in. She'd known that, but knowing it and living from it were different. The knowing was something she held in her head. The living was something that happened in your hands, in your habits, in what you did when someone told you there was no room for you and you went ahead and made room anyway. the flour sack. That was part of it. But it wasn't the dramatic gesture that had changed something. It was everything before it. The records column, the delivery counting, the decision, made quietly in the first week, that she was going to document everything, not because she knew exactly what was coming, but because she understood that a woman in her position needed to know where she stood. The decision to stay when leaving would have been easier. The decision to sit down at the table with Elias Boone one night when she could have stayed standing. She hadn't walked into Iron Creek Ranch knowing she was going to do any of those things. She'd walked in because she needed a job and she had $37 and a skillet. The rest was what happened when you were too stubborn to leave and too practical to fall apart. That was the thing nobody told you. They told you that you'd find yourself, or that you'd prove something, or that the world would recognize your worth eventually. What actually happened was simpler and harder than any of that. You just kept doing the next thing. You kept the fires going. You wrote things down. You swung the flour sack when the time came. And at some point, without a particular announcement, you looked around and realized that the life you were living was yours. Not the one you'd survived, not the one you were enduring, yours. Something you'd actually built. In May, Elias asked her to marry him. He did it the way he did everything, without performance, without the kind of elaborate staging that some men felt was required. They were standing at the creek, which was lower now, back to its ordinary clear self, the evening light doing what evening light did in Wyoming, which was to make you understand why people stayed in difficult country. He said, "I'd like to ask you something." She said, "All right." He said, "I'd like it if you'd stay, permanently, not as cook." He paused. "As mine, as someone who this place is also for." Another pause. He was not smooth about it. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was working through something difficult. "I'm asking badly." "You're asking honestly," she said. "That's better." He looked at her. "Is that a yes?" She thought about $37 and a skillet. She thought about the men laughing at the fence. She thought about a column of discrepancies and a night in a spring house covered in flour dust, and a man stepping between her and something that meant to harm her. Not dramatically, just quietly, just, "This is as far as it goes." "Yes," she said. He reached out and took her hand. He held it the way he did everything, carefully, like it was something real rather than something to be managed. They stood by the creek for a while. The water moved, the light moved. The ranch behind them made its evening sounds. "It's going to be a lot of work," he said. "I know. The ranch is better, but it's not. There's still years of—" "Elias," she said. "Yes?" "I know," she said. "I've seen the books." He made that sound that was almost a laugh. She was becoming partial to that sound. The summer was the hardest and the best one Clara could remember. Hard because building something honest from the wreckage of something corrupt was not clean work. It was slow and particular and full of small reverses and moments where the progress wasn't visible even though it was happening. Best because it was hers. She expanded the kitchen garden in June, which had been neglected for years. Santos helped her. It turned out he'd grown up farming before he'd come north, and he had opinions about soil and spacing that were both correct and delivered with the contained authority of someone who knew what they were talking about and didn't need you to acknowledge it. By August, the garden was producing more than the cookhouse could use, and she'd started preserving, jars lined up on the shelf in the cool room, their contents vivid and strange-looking in the way that preserved things were, summer locked into winter-ready form. She still cooked for the hands. She didn't stop that when she married Elias in June, a small ceremony in Dunmore with Aldous and Perkins and Della and Santos as the whole of the attendants, which felt exactly right, no more and no less than the thing required. She still cooked because she was good at it and because she wanted to, and because you didn't stop being what you were just because your circumstances changed. She hired a girl from Dunmore to help 3 days a week, which Della had recommended and who turned out to be both competent and pleasantly unsentimental about the work. Dooley stayed. He was not a man who had covered himself in glory, but he worked hard and he'd done what Clara told him to do, made himself useful going forward rather than apologetic about the past, which was the only form of sorry that actually meant anything. She didn't forget what he'd done, but she didn't run the ranch on old grievances either. That was Kincaid's way. She intended to run it differently. By fall, Iron Creek had new supply contracts with 3 Dunmore merchants, all properly documented and signed in duplicate. The accounts were current and clean. Elias had promoted Santos to foreman, not with fanfare, just a conversation and a handshake, which was exactly how Santos would have wanted it. And Santos had responded by becoming exactly what the ranch needed, someone who worked the same way he always had, with the same competence and the same quiet authority, just officially now. Perkins, when he heard, said, "Took long enough." Santos said, "Yes." That was the whole of the conversation. In October, a year after the night in the spring house, Clara stood at the cookhouse window at 4 a.m. watching the dark, waiting for the fires to build. She thought about a woman who'd arrived at a gate with a bag and $37 and been laughed at before she put the bag down. She thought about how that woman had felt standing in the cookhouse on her first morning, surveying a wreck of a kitchen and making herself take inventory instead of walking back out the door. She didn't feel sorry for that woman. She didn't feel the way people expected you to feel about difficult things in your past, grateful for the lesson, or at peace with the journey, or any of the other tidy resolutions that life didn't actually deliver. She felt something more specific than any of that. She felt like herself, which was not a small thing, and which she understood now she hadn't always felt, not fully, not the way she did standing in a kitchen that was hers, and a ranch that was partly hers, and a life that was entirely hers in the way that mattered most. The fires came up. The kitchen filled with warmth. She heard the door of the main house open and shut. Elias moving across the yard in the dark the way he did some mornings, the early riser habit too deep to change. She saw the lantern light move. She heard his boots on the cookhouse step. He came in and poured his own coffee, which he'd started doing around December of last year and which she'd never commented on and didn't now. "Morning," he said. "Morning." He sat at the table. He drank his coffee. She started the biscuits. Outside, the sky was beginning to go gray at the edges, that first barely perceptible lightning that came before the actual dawn. The creek made its sound. The cattle were moving somewhere out in the far pasture, their slow weight shifting in the dark. Iron Creek Ranch. One woman's kitchen. One man's land. Something they were building together that had no smooth edges and no clean lines, and was, for exactly that reason, worth building. The biscuits went into the oven. The morning came up gold.